fork stopped halfway to my mouth when the gravy hit me. Cold, congealed beef gravy from the doggy bag my son-in-law had brought back from his lunch the day before. It ran down my forehead, into my eyes, down the collar of my charcoal suit. The kind of suit I'd worn for 41 years of board meetings without a single stain. The Stockton grill went quiet. Not all at once. First the table next to ours, then the one behind. Then the bartender stopped wiping the glass in his hand. A woman at the corner banquette covered her mouth. My son-in-law was laughing. Not a chuckle. A real, full-belly laugh, his head tilted back, the empty styrofoam container still in his hand. "That's what you get, old man," he said. "Maybe now you'll listen when somebody talks to you." And then I heard her voice. My daughter, the girl I used to carry on my shoulders through the orchards behind our first house in Greenville. The girl who used to fall asleep with her hand on my wrist because she said my pulse made her feel safe. "He's right, Dad. You had it coming." I didn't say anything. I picked up my linen napkin, the one with the restaurant's gold monogram, and I wiped my face. I wiped my eyes. I wiped the gravy off my watch. A Patek my late wife gave me on our 30th anniversary, 2 years before the cancer took her. I folded the napkin, set it on the plate, and I stood up. I left $200 bills under the water glass for the busboy who was going to have to clean my chair. I walked out of the Stockton Grill onto the sidewalk on West Trade Street. It was September in Charlotte, still warm. The air smelling like rain coming. I stood there for a second with gravy in my hair, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the day my wife died. I felt completely, perfectly calm. I took my phone out of my inside pocket. I scrolled to a name I hadn't called in about 6 months, and I pressed the green button. "It's me," I said when she picked up. "I need you to start it, all of it, tomorrow morning." She didn't ask which part. She didn't need to. I'd been preparing for this phone call for almost a year. I just hadn't known until that moment that I was actually going to make it. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much for this. People who knew me back then called me a lot of things, some of them flattering, some of them not. I built a company, started it in a rented warehouse in Gastonia in 1986 with a partner who left 2 years later. And by the time I was 64, I was sitting on the board of 3 regional banks and a logistics firm that moved freight from Savannah up through the Carolinas. My net worth was the kind of number you stop counting after a certain point because it doesn't mean anything different in your day-to-day life. I drove a 10-year-old Lexus. I cut my own grass on Saturdays. My wife, before she got sick, used to tease me that we ate at Cracker Barrel more than the senior citizens with the discount cards. We had 1 child, a daughter. I'm going to call her my daughter through this whole thing because saying her name still does something to my throat that I don't like. She was born when I was 36. We'd been trying for almost a decade. When the doctor put her in my arms in that hospital room in Charlotte, I cried for the first time since I was a boy in Kentucky. My wife laughed at me through her own tears. She said, "There he goes." I gave that girl everything. I want to be honest about this part because the comments people sometimes leave on stories like mine cut to the bone, and they're often right. I gave her too much. Ballet at 4. Private school at 5. Her first horse at 9. A car at 16. A brand new one. Not the used Camry I'd argued for at first because my wife thought a girl that young needed something reliable and beautiful both, and I have never been able to deny my wife anything. College anywhere she wanted, paid in full, no loans. A condo in uptown Charlotte for her last 2 years at Wake Forest. A trust fund she could access at 25. I told myself I was being a good father. I told myself I was giving her the launch pad I never had. My own father worked at a tire plant in Bowling Green and died at 58 with $3,000 in the bank. I told myself she would understand the value of it because she was watching me work for it. She did not understand the value of it. I see that now. I saw it then too, honestly, but I told myself she just needed more time. She met him in her last year of college. He was a year ahead. Business major, lacrosse player, jaw like a yearbook photo. I'll call him my son-in-law because that's what he became, even if I never wanted to claim him. I had concerns from the first dinner. He spent 90 minutes at the table telling me about his vision, That was the word he used, vision, for the men's grooming brand he was going to launch with his fraternity brothers. He asked me what I thought. I told him I thought a man should work for somebody else for at least 5 years before he tried to be his own boss, just to learn what bad management looks like so he didn't replicate it. He smiled at me with his teeth and said, "That's old school thinking, sir." I should have known then. My wife pulled me aside in the kitchen after dessert and said, "Promise me you'll be kind to him. She's in love." And because my wife was already sick by that point, and her hands were already shaking when she held her coffee cup, I promised. They got married a year and a half later, 6 months after my wife passed. I walked my daughter down the aisle at the Duke Mansion. I wrote them a check for the wedding that I won't mention the size of because it would make people angry. I bought them a house in Myers Park as a wedding present. 4 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a magnolia in the front yard. The men's grooming brand never launched. Of course it didn't. He spent the seed money I gave him on a leased BMW, a closet full of suits from a custom tailor in South Park, and trips to Cabo with his lacrosse buddies. When I asked him about the business plan 18 months in, he told me his angel investors had pulled out due to market conditions. There were no angel investors. There was just me. I got him a job. I called a friend who ran the commercial real estate arm of one of the banks I sat on. I called in a favor I'd been holding for 15 years. My son-in-law walked into a 6-figure analyst position with full benefits, an office with a window, and a boss who was instructed, though my son-in-law never knew this, to be patient with him. That was the first of 3 jobs I got him. He lost the first one for, quote, fit reasons. He lost the second for showing up hungover to a Monday client breakfast and telling the client her industry was, quote, kind of boring. I got him a third one anyway because my daughter cried on the phone and said they were going to lose the house I'd bought them. For 4 years, I was the silent foundation under every single thing in their lives. The mortgage assistance, the car payments when his BMW lease ran out and he wanted a Range Rover, the vacation to Italy for their anniversary, the country club initiation. My daughter never had a job. She had a wellness business on Instagram where she sold supplements to 700 followers, most of them her sorority sisters' mothers. I never said anything. I told myself my wife wouldn't have wanted me to. It got worse. Slowly, the way these things do. The phone calls stopped being weekly and became monthly. The visits stopped happening at all, unless I drove out to Myers Park. My birthday last year, she sent a text, just a text, with an emoji of a cake. The thing that broke me, and I want to be clear that this happened before the gravy, this happened months before, was my 65th. I'd told her I wanted a small dinner. The 3 of us, plus my sister, who'd flown in from Knoxville. I picked a steakhouse I liked, made the reservation a month in advance. The night of, my daughter texted me 40 minutes before the reservation and said something had come up. My son-in-law had a work thing. They wouldn't make it. I sat in that restaurant with my sister, and we ate 2 fillets and split a bottle of Cabernet, and my sister, who is 71 years old and has never lied to me in her life, took my hand across the table and said, "Brother, that girl is not going to come around on her own. You understand that, don't you?" I told her I did. I didn't, so this brings me to the Stockton Grill. It was a Tuesday. My son-in-law had asked to meet me for lunch, a thing he had never once done in 8 years. I assumed he wanted money. I assumed I would say yes. I usually did. My daughter came with him, which surprised me. She kissed me on the cheek when I walked in. She looked thin. Her eyes were doing that thing where they don't quite land on you. We ordered, made small talk about nothing. He waited until the entrees came. "So here's the deal," he said. "We need you to liquidate the trust." The trust was the one my wife and I had set up when our daughter was born. It was supposed to be hers when she turned 25. It was, by then, worth a substantial sum. I'd kept adding to it over the years, even after she'd already received it. I'd quietly restructured it 3 years earlier when I started to notice things, so that she had to come to me to access amounts over a certain threshold. She knew this. She'd been furious about it at the time. I asked him what he meant by liquidate. "All of it," he said. "Cash. We've got a real opportunity, and we need to move on it now." I asked what the opportunity was. He looked at my daughter. She looked at her plate. "It's a crypto thing," he said. "But it's not what you're thinking. This is a guy I went to school with. He's been crushing it. He's letting a small group of us in on the next round." I set my fork down. I told him no. I told him no in the calmest voice I had. I told him I had concerns about the structure of what he was describing. I told him I would be happy to look at the documentation, talk to the guy from school, even bring in someone from my own financial team to do due diligence. I said all of this without raising my voice. I have spent 50 years in business. I know how to say no without saying no. He didn't hear any of it. Or he heard all of it, and it just didn't matter. He said, "You know what your problem is? You sit on that money like a dragon. You think you earned it, but you got lucky. And now you're going to die with it because you're too cheap to actually help your own family." My daughter didn't say anything. I told him I was going to ask for the check. That's when he reached down to the bag at his feet. The leftovers from yesterday's lunch. He'd carried it into the restaurant. I'd noticed but hadn't thought anything of it. People do strange things in expensive restaurants sometimes. He stood up. He took 2 steps. He poured it on my head. And my daughter said the words I'm going to carry with me until I'm dead. "He's right, Dad. You had it coming." The woman I called from the sidewalk was my chief of staff. Her name doesn't matter for this story either, but she'd worked for me for 19 years and she knew where everybody in my professional life was buried. She'd been the one who built the contingency file, the one we never talked about. When you spent 40 years in business, you accumulate things, you accumulate favors, you accumulate knowledge, you accumulate small acts of generosity that people remember. I had, over the years, made sure that the system supporting my daughter's life ran through me, not visibly, not in any way she could see, but the bank where they held their mortgage. I had a relationship with the regional president from a Rotary committee we'd served on together, the lender on the Range River lease. That was one of the firms I'd helped take public in the 90s, the country club. I'd been a member there since before my daughter was born, and the membership committee chair was a man whose mother I'd quietly paid for hospice care for in 2011 when his family was about to lose their house. The trust fund, the one my son-in-law had demanded I liquidate, had a clause my daughter had never read. A clause about disparagement and assault of the trustee. I'd had it written in when I restructured it. I hadn't expected to ever need it. I'd had it written in because my chief of staff had said, "just in case." That phone call set things in motion in a way that, the next morning, looked from the outside like a series of completely unrelated, unfortunate events. The first call my son-in-law got was from his employer. There was apparently a review of his performance file that had been pending for some time. The bank had decided to consolidate his department. His position was being eliminated. He could collect his things by end-of-day Friday. The severance package would be modest, in line with company policy. The second call my daughter got was from the bank that held the mortgage on the Myers Park house. There were some irregularities in the original loan documentation, a co-signer relationship that had not been properly disclosed. The note was being called. They had 30 days to refinance through another institution or to bring the balance current. The Range Rover was repossessed on a Thursday because the lease payments had, it turned out, been auto-drafted from an account I controlled. I simply stopped authorizing the drafts. They got the call from the lender. They had 48 hours. The country club membership lapsed for non-payment. The credit cards, the ones I had been silently underwriting through a small business credit relationship in their name, froze. In about 11 days, my daughter went from one life to another life. Same person. Different oxygen. She called me on the 12th day. I let it go to voicemail. Not out of cruelty. I just couldn't pick it up yet. She left a message that was mostly her crying. She said her credit card had been declined at a Harris Teeter buying groceries and the cashier had asked if she had another form of payment and she didn't. She said the man at the dealership had been rude to her when they came for the car. She asked me what was happening. She said she was scared. She did not, in that first message, say she was sorry. She called again the next day. And the next. By the 5th call, she'd figured out enough of it to start putting it together. By the 7th call, she was angry. She left a message saying I was a monster. That she'd been right about me all along, that her husband was right. I listened to that message 3 times, then I deleted it. Her husband moved out the second week. I learned about this from a friend who saw him eating alone at a Bojangles, or 577 with 2 suitcases in the back of a rented Hyundai. He went back to his parents in Greensboro. The lacrosse buddy stopped returning his calls because, it turned out, the crypto opportunity had not been real. He had been planning, with the money he'd hoped to extract from me, to recover losses from a different scheme that had already collapsed. He owed people. People who were now not getting paid. My daughter, alone in a house she could no longer afford, with no income, no credit, and no husband, called me on day 23. She didn't lead with anger that time. She said, "Daddy, I don't know what to do." It was the first time she called me daddy since she was about 12 years old. I want to tell you that I felt vindicated when she said that. I want to tell you I felt like I'd won. I didn't. I sat in my kitchen in the dark, and I cried like a child for about 40 minutes. Because the truth is, the gravy on my head had never been the wound. The wound was that I'd lost her years before that. I just refused to look at it. I called her back the next morning. I told her to meet me at a coffee shop in Plaza Midwood. Not at my house. Not at hers. She showed up in clothes I recognized from years ago. A sweater I'd bought her when she was 20. She'd lost weight. Her hair was unwashed. Her hands shook a little when she reached for the coffee. I told her I was not going to bail her out. I told her I loved her. I told her I had always loved her. I told her I was going to do something for her, that her mother and I should have done 20 years earlier, and that I was sorry it had taken this. I told her the house was going to be sold to settle the mortgage. I would not buy it back for her. I told her the trust fund was, per the disparagement clause, no longer accessible to her. I told her she could fight that legally if she wanted to, and that she would lose, because I had structured it carefully. I told her what I was offering instead. I owned, through one of my smaller holdings, an interest in a property management company that ran a portfolio of small apartment buildings around Charlotte. Nothing glamorous. 2-bedroom units in working neighborhoods. The kind of buildings where the residents call the office because their disposal is broken and somebody has to actually go fix it. I was offering her a job. Entry level. Property assistant. $42,000 a year. Health benefits. She would answer phones, schedule maintenance, walk units between tenants. Her boss would be a 46-year-old woman named, I'll just call her my friend because she's a friend, who had been with the company for 20 years and who I had already briefed. I told my daughter she could take it or leave it. I told her if she took it, she would receive no special treatment. She would be evaluated on her performance. If she missed work, she would be written up. If she was rude to tenants, she would be fired. If she lasted a year, we would talk about what came next. I told her I had rented a small apartment for her in Nodar. 1 bedroom, 640 square feet. It was paid for the first 6 months. After that, she was on her own for rent. I told her I was not going to see her socially during her first year of working there. No Sunday dinners, no phone calls, except to coordinate logistics. She had something to figure out and I was not going to be in the room while she figured it out. Because I had been in the room for too much of her life already, and that was the original sin. I told her I loved her. She cried at the table. She didn't argue. She nodded. She took the job. The first 6 months were ugly. I heard from my friend about it indirectly. My daughter was late twice in the first week. She got a stern conversation. She was late once more the second week and was written up. She cried in the bathroom. She came in on time after that. She didn't know how to use the property management software. She had to learn. She didn't know how to talk to plumbers. She had to learn. A tenant, a woman in her 70s on a fixed income, called the office one Tuesday morning hysterical because her ceiling was leaking, and my daughter, who had never in her life had to be the calm voice on the other end of someone else's emergency, had to figure out how to be that voice. She drove to the woman's apartment with a roll of paper towels and a number for a roofer. She stayed for 2 hours. She drove the woman to her doctor's appointment afterward because the woman was shaken. That woman, I learned later, sent me a handwritten thank you note that my daughter never knew about. I keep it in a drawer. The husband filed for divorce in month 4. He'd already moved in with a new girlfriend in Greensboro. The divorce was simple because there was nothing to divide. In month 7, my daughter called me. Just to talk. She told me she'd gotten an email from a tenant thanking her for handling a deposit dispute. She told me it felt strange to be thanked by a stranger for something she'd done at her job. She said it was the first time in her adult life she'd been useful to somebody who couldn't do anything for her in return. She didn't say sorry on that call either, but I could hear it underneath. The actual apology came at month 9. She drove to my house on a Sunday afternoon without calling first, which was against our agreement. I almost didn't open the door. I'm glad I did. She sat on my back porch and she talked for a long time. About the wedding, about the way she treated me at my wife's funeral, which I haven't even told you about because some things are still too tender. About the way she let her husband talk about me when I wasn't in the room, and how she told herself it was love, and how she could see now that it had been something else entirely. Something closer to wanting permission to not be the person her mother had raised her to be. She talked about her mother. She cried about her mother. She said she'd been angry at her mother for dying and she'd taken it out on me because I was the one who was still there. I didn't say much. I let her talk. When she was done, she said, "I don't expect anything from you, Daddy." I just needed to say all of that out loud to the one person who was supposed to hear it. I told her I forgave her. I told her I had forgiven her on the sidewalk outside the Stockton Grill, the moment I made that phone call, because forgiveness isn't the same as letting somebody back into your life. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself. I told her she still had to keep showing up to work on Monday. She laughed. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in maybe 3 years. She's been at the company 2 years now. She was promoted to property manager last spring. She runs 3 buildings. She lives in a slightly larger apartment that she pays for herself, in a neighborhood she chose. She's dating a man who works as a paramedic and who, the one time I met him, brought me a jar of honey from his uncle's farm in Stanley County. I liked him. We'll see. She doesn't have access to the trust. She's never asked. She drives a used Honda Civic that she financed on her own credit, which she had to rebuild from the bottom because the joint cards with her ex-husband had all gone to collections. She did that work too. I watched her do it without helping. People who know the story sometimes ask me if I think I went too far. They ask whether costing my son-in-law his job was a step beyond what he deserved, whether I should have just frozen the trust and left it at that. I don't have a clean answer. I think about it. I think a man who pours food on his father-in-law's head in a public restaurant has already shown the world who he is, and the world is generally entitled to respond. I think I might have done the same thing for a stranger if I'd had the means. I also think I was angry, and anger and justice are not always the same animal, and I'm not pretending they were that day. What I do know is this. My daughter is somebody now. She wasn't before. She was a person other people had built, like a house with no foundation, just the framing nailed onto air. Everything I'd given her had been a wall or a roof or a window, and she'd lived inside it without ever asking what was underneath. When I pulled it all away, she had to put down a foundation herself, with her own hands, in dirt. It was the cruelest thing I ever did for her. It was also the kindest. I went back to the Stockton Grill about a year after the gravy, by myself. I ordered the same thing I'd ordered that day. I left the same waiter a much bigger tip. He remembered me. He didn't say anything about it, but I could tell. I just nodded at him on the way out, and he nodded back, and that was all that needed to be said between 2 men who'd both witnessed something they couldn't unsee. My wife used to tell me, when our daughter was small and I was working too much and feeling guilty about it, that the best thing a parent can give a child isn't comfort. It's the chance to become somebody. I didn't understand her when she said it. I thought she was being poetic. I understand her now. I'm 67 years old. I have a daughter again. Not the one I had before. That one is gone, and I've made peace with that. The one I have now is a 33-year-old woman who calls me on Sunday afternoons and tells me about a tenant who finally paid their back rent, or a contractor who tried to overcharge her and didn't get away with it, or a paramedic who makes her laugh. She calls me Daddy. It still does something to my throat. People ask me sometimes what I learned from all of it. The gravy. The phone call. The 11 days that took my daughter's whole life apart, like a watch being opened on a jeweler's cloth. I never have a tidy answer ready, because the truth is messier than the kind of lesson you can stitch onto a pillow. What I learned is that love and comfort are not the same thing. I had spent 33 years confusing them. Every check I wrote, every house I bought, every job I called in a favor for, I told myself was love. It wasn't. It was comfort. Mine, mostly. I couldn't stand to watch my daughter struggle, so I made sure she never had to, and what I built for her with all that good intention was a life she didn't know how to stand up inside of. When Daniel poured that gravy on my head and she didn't flinch, that wasn't her cruelty talking. That was the cost of never having had to be brave for anything in her life. A person who has never carried a load doesn't know what a load costs other people to carry. Cause and effect. That's all any of this was. I made her soft, and softness called to a man who knew how to take advantage of it, and the two of them together built something that could only end the way it ended. The phone call I made on that sidewalk wasn't revenge. It was the first honest thing I'd done as her father in 20 years. I stopped paying for the version of her life that was killing her. The thing about character is that you can't give it to somebody. You can't write it into a trust fund or wrap it up at Christmas. It only grows in the hours when nobody is rescuing you. I watched my daughter, Margaret, learn that the hard way at 31 years old, on the phone with a plumber in a one-bedroom apartment in Noda, with no husband and no credit card and no father coming to save her. And she became someone. Not the daughter I'd raised. Someone better. Someone she made herself, with her own 2 hands, out of the rubble I left her standing in. If you are a parent and you are reading this, I want to say one thing to you that I wish somebody had said to me when my Linda was still alive and our girl was small. The kindest thing you can do for your child is not to remove every obstacle from their path. It is to teach them that they are strong enough to walk through some of them, withhold sometimes, say no sometimes. Let them feel the small weight before it becomes the crushing one. I am 67 now. My daughter calls me daddy again. We earned that word back together, the long way, and it means more to me than any check I ever wrote her. That's the only sermon I've got. Take it or leave it. I'll be on the porch.